We're executing the merger agreement at midnight tonight. That's what Marcus Davenport, our CEO, announced during the emergency executive meeting on a Friday evening in October 2023, standing at the head of the conference table with the kind of aggressive confidence that comes from believing you're about to pull off the deal of a lifetime. Executing at midnight. I'd been director of strategic partnerships at Dataflow Systems for 6 years, managing vendor relationships and contract negotiations worth approximately $48 million annually, ensuring every agreement protected our interests and every clause anticipated scenarios that executives couldn't imagine when they were focused on closing deals. But according to Marcus and his hand-picked merger advisor, Bradley Chen, my concerns about technical contract details were slowing down a time-sensitive acquisition that would transform Dataflow from a regional player into a national competitor, and they decided to finalize the merger with TechCore Solutions before the weekend so that by Monday morning the deal would be done and any objections would be irrelevant. I'm Harper Sinclair, and I sat in that conference room at Dataflow Systems watching Marcus explain how the merger would be seamlessly executed over the weekend while I knew exactly why they'd chosen midnight on a Friday. They were trying to finalize the deal before anyone had time to review the contracts carefully, before board members could consult with advisors, before anyone could discover that this merger violated a vendor clause I negotiated 4 years earlier that would automatically trigger penalties severe enough to destroy the deal's entire financial justification. 6 years, 4 months, and 7 days of building strategic partnerships that protected Dataflow's interests, and Marcus had decided that contract clauses were technical paperwork that couldn't be allowed to interfere with his legacy-defining acquisition. I wasn't the CEO who made billion-dollar decisions or the CFO who structured financing deals. I drove a 2019 Honda Accord with 87,000 miles on it and a collection of contract binders in the trunk because I reviewed vendor agreements during weekend mornings at coffee shops when most executives were playing golf. I lived in a modest townhouse in Raleigh with a home office containing filing cabinets organized by vendor, contract renewal dates, and escalation clauses that I'd memorized because understanding the details of strategic agreements requires actually reading them rather than skimming executive summaries prepared by attorneys who don't understand the operational implications. My bookshelf contained contract law textbooks, negotiation strategy guides, and 3-ring binders with every major vendor agreement Dataflow had signed in the past decade, annotated with notes about why specific clauses existed and what scenarios they were designed to prevent. I was detail-oriented, methodical about contract language, protective of Dataflow's strategic interests, and apparently creating obstacles for executives who thought vendor contracts were boilerplate paperwork rather than strategic instruments that could make or break company value. The trouble had started 3 months earlier when TechCore Solutions, a West Coast competitor about 30% larger than Dataflow, had approached Marcus about a potential merger. TechCore was backed by venture capital firms looking to consolidate the market, and they'd identified Dataflow as an ideal acquisition target that would give them East Coast presence and access to our government and healthcare clients. The proposed deal valued Dataflow at $218 million, which represented a significant premium over our last private valuation of $163 million, and Marcus saw this as his opportunity to achieve the kind of exit that would cement his reputation as a visionary who'd built a company worth acquiring. Marcus hired Bradley Chen, a merger advisor from a boutique M&A firm, to structure the transaction. Bradley had that consultant energy, expensive suits, buzzword vocabulary, and complete certainty that any deal could be closed if you moved fast enough and didn't let technical objections slow down momentum. His approach was to position the merger as a strategic combination of equals, where Dataflow shareholders would receive TechCore stock plus cash, existing management would be retained in senior roles, and the combined entity would achieve market leadership through complementary capabilities. He created presentations showing revenue synergies, cost savings from consolidated operations, and projected growth that would make everyone wealthy if they just signed the agreements and executed quickly. The due diligence process had been rushed. TechCore's team spent 3 weeks reviewing Dataflow's financials, customer contracts, and operational metrics, but they focused primarily on revenue, growth rates, and profitability rather than diving deep into vendor relationships and contractual obligations. Bradley kept emphasizing speed. We need to move quickly before market conditions change or competitors make their own moves, and Marcus embraced this urgency as validation that the deal was time-sensitive and valuable. I was brought into the process in late August when Bradley's team requested information about Dataflow's vendor relationships as part of due diligence. I provided a comprehensive overview. We had strategic partnerships with 11 major technology vendors who provided everything from cloud infrastructure to security services to data analytics platforms. These weren't simple supplier relationships. They were deep integrations where our product was built on top of vendor technologies, where we had co-marketing agreements, where our customers depended on these vendor capabilities as part of the data flow solution. During a due diligence meeting on September 8, I mentioned to Bradley and Marcus that several of our vendor contracts contain change of control clauses that would need to be reviewed as part of merger planning. Change of control clauses are standard provisions that give vendors certain rights if their customer gets acquired or merged, often including the ability to renegotiate pricing, terminate the agreement, or require consent before the transaction closes. Bradley dismissed this casually. Change of control provisions are standard boilerplate. We'll handle them as part of post-merger integration. They're not material to deal with valuation. I tried to explain that some of our clauses weren't standard boilerplate, that I negotiated specific provisions to protect data flow's interests that might have implications for merger timing and structure. Marcus cut me off. Harper, I appreciate your thoroughness, but we can't let every vendor contract become a negotiation point that delays this deal. Bradley's team has done hundreds of M&A transactions. They know how to handle change of control provisions. Let's stay focused on closing this deal rather than creating obstacles. That was the first warning sign. Marcus had decided that contract details were obstacles rather than strategic considerations that might affect deal viability. Over the next 6 weeks, as merger negotiations progressed and agreements were drafted, I kept trying to raise concerns about vendor contracts. Each time, I was told the same thing: don't slow down the deal with technical details that can be handled later. On October 6, the merger agreement was substantially complete. The deal terms were finalized. Dataflow shareholders would receive TechCore stock valued at $142 million plus $76 million in cash. Marcus would become president of Enterprise Solutions at the combined company, and the transaction would close by October 31. The board was scheduled to vote on October 20, giving them 2 weeks to review the agreement and approve or reject the merger. On October 12, I requested a meeting with Marcus and Bradley to discuss vendor contract implications that hadn't been addressed in merger planning. The meeting lasted 17 minutes. I started explaining that our largest vendor, Cloud Tech Infrastructure, had a change of control clause I'd negotiated in 2019 that included specific provisions about merger scenarios. Bradley interrupted. Harper, we've reviewed the vendor contracts. Cloud Tech has standard change of control language that requires notification and gives them limited renegotiation rights. This is handled in the merger agreement through standard indemnification provisions. We're not concerned. I tried to explain that Cloud Tech's clause wasn't standard, that I'd negotiated additional provisions beyond typical change of control language. Marcus stood up. Harper, I'm going to be direct. Bradley's firm has closed $2 billion in M&A transactions this year. They know what they're doing. Your job is to manage vendor relationships after the merger closes, not to create legal objections that delay the deal. If Cloud Tech has concerns post-merger, you'll work with them to resolve those concerns. But we're not letting vendor contracts become negotiation leverage that slows down this transaction. I left that meeting knowing exactly what was happening. Marcus and Bradley were rushing toward a midnight closing before anyone had time to fully review the implications of contracts they didn't understand. They dismissed my concerns as technical objections from someone who didn't grasp the bigger strategic picture. And they were about to discover that the technical details they'd ignored would destroy the deal's entire financial justification. Now about 76% of you think I'm about to sabotage the merger by deliberately alerting vendors or tipping off the board, and you're completely wrong. Subscribe right now, because what actually happens is that a contract clause does exactly what it was designed to do: protect data flow's interests by automatically triggering when specific conditions occur, and executives who didn't bother reading their own vendor agreements learn expensive lessons about why contract details matter. On October 18, 2 days before the board vote, Bradley announced that they were accelerating the closing timeline. We've received indication from TechCore's lead investor that market conditions may be shifting and they want to close the deal as soon as possible. We're recommending the board vote on October 20 as scheduled, but then execute the closing immediately, this Friday night at midnight, to get the deal done before the weekend. When the CFO asked why midnight, Bradley explained it as optimal timing for regulatory filings and bank transfers across time zones. What this really meant was that Marcus and Bradley wanted to close the deal before board members had time for thorough review, before anyone could raise uncomfortable questions, before the weekend gave people time to consult with advisors who might spot problems. Midnight Friday closing meant the deal would be legally executed before most people even knew it had happened, and by Monday morning when everyone was back in the office, the merger would be finalized and any objections would be too late. The board meeting on October 20th lasted 2 hours. Marcus presented the strategic rationale, market consolidation opportunity, revenue synergies, enhanced competitive position, attractive valuation that delivered significant returns to shareholders. Bradley presented the financial structure, cash and stock consideration, management retention, timeline for closing. The board asked questions about due diligence, regulatory approvals, and integration planning. Marcus and Bradley provided confident answers emphasizing that all material issues had been reviewed and the deal was ready to execute. One board member, Patricia Nguyen, who'd been a venture investor before joining Dataflow's board, asked about vendor contracts. Have we reviewed all material vendor agreements to understand any change of control implications or renegotiation triggers? Bradley responded smoothly. Yes, we conducted a comprehensive vendor contract review as part of due diligence. There are standard change of control provisions in several agreements that will require notification and may allow limited renegotiation discussions post-closing. These provisions are typical in M&A transactions and don't present material risks to deal valuation. We've included standard indemnification language in the merger agreement to address any vendor adjustment costs. Patricia looked at me. Harper, you manage our vendor relationships. Any concerns about vendor reactions to this merger? I was sitting in the back of the conference room as a non-voting attendee. Marcus and Bradley had made it clear I should not raise objections during the board presentation. But Patricia had asked me directly. Several of our vendor contracts contain change of control provisions that may have implications for deal structure and timing. I'd recommend a detailed review of specific clause language before finalizing the closing timeline. Marcus jumped in before I could continue. Harper has been appropriately thorough in flagging vendor contract provisions for post-closing management. Bradley's team has reviewed these provisions and confirmed they don't present material deal risks. Harper will work with vendors after closing to address any standard renegotiation discussions. Patricia looked like she wanted to ask follow-up questions, but Marcus had effectively shut down that line of inquiry by characterizing my concern as already reviewed and addressed. The board voted. 7 directors voted to approve the merger agreement and authorize management to execute closing. Patricia abstained, citing concerns about timeline compression and vendor contract review. The merger was approved. Marcus and Bradley scheduled the midnight closing for October 27th, exactly 1 week away. Over the next week, merger closing preparations accelerated. Legal teams finalized documents. Banks prepared wire transfers. TechCore's integration team began planning the Monday morning announcement. Marcus and Bradley were operating with the confidence of executives who'd successfully navigated a complex transaction to completion. On October 26, the day before midnight closing, Bradley sent an email to the deal team, all closing conditions satisfied. Documents ready for execution. Wire transfers confirmed. Tomorrow at midnight we will close this deal and transform both companies. I spent October 26 at my desk reviewing the cloud tech infrastructure contract one more time. I'd negotiated this agreement in 2019 when Dataflow was implementing a major cloud infrastructure upgrade. Cloud Tech was our primary infrastructure vendor, providing the servers, networking, and cloud services that powered our entire platform. The contract was worth approximately $14 million annually, making Cloud Tech our largest vendor expense and a critical dependency for our operations. During the 2019 negotiations, Cloud Tech had insisted on standard change of control language giving them notification rights and the ability to renegotiate if Dataflow was acquired. I'd agreed to that provision but had negotiated additional language to protect Dataflow's interests. The clause I'd added, buried in Section 12.4 (c) of the 63-page agreement, stated, in the event customer undergoes a change of control via merger or acquisition with a company that maintains existing vendor relationships with a cloud tech competitor for substantially similar infrastructure services, cloud tech shall have the right to 1. Require immediate renegotiation of pricing and terms to match or exceed the economics provided to such competitor relationship, or 2. Terminate this agreement upon 30 days written notice, or 3. Require payment of a contract value protection fee equal to 3 times annual contract value, payable upon closing of such change of control transaction. I negotiated this clause because in 2019, there were rumors that data flow might be acquired by larger competitors who had their own infrastructure vendors, and I wanted to ensure cloud tech couldn't simply walk away from our contract without data flow receiving compensation for the relationship value we'd built. The 3 times annual contract value protection fee was designed to be severe enough that any acquirer would need to either commit to continuing the cloud tech relationship or pay a significant penalty for terminating it. The clause had seemed academic in 2019. Data flow wasn't being acquired, and cloud tech was happy with the relationship. I'd included the provision as protective insurance that would probably never be triggered. 4 years later, that insurance was about to pay off in a way I'd never anticipated. TechCore Solutions, the company acquiring Dataflow, had its own infrastructure vendor, Quantum Cloud Systems, Cloud Tech's largest and most aggressive competitor. TechCore's entire platform was built on quantum infrastructure. As part of post-merger integration planning, TechCore's technical team had already announced they would migrate Dataflow's systems from Cloud Tech to Quantum, to achieve infrastructure standardization and cost savings through consolidated vendor relationships. This migration was featured prominently in Bradley's merger presentations as a source of projected cost synergies. Eliminating the $14 million annual cloud tech contract would save money and simplify operations. What Marcus, Bradley, and TechCore's team had failed to understand was that migrating data flow from cloud tech to quantum was precisely the scenario that would trigger Section 12.4 (c) of the cloud tech contract. Dataflow was undergoing a change of control via merger with a company that maintained existing relationships with Cloud Tech as competitor for substantially similar infrastructure services. The clause was triggered automatically upon closing. Cloud Tech would have 3 options: renegotiate pricing to match whatever economics Quantum was providing to TechCore, terminate the contract upon 30 days notice, or require immediate payment of 3 times annual contract value, $42 million. Payable upon closing of the merger transaction. $42 million. That was more than half the cash consideration TechCore was paying for the entire Dataflow acquisition. If Cloud Tech exercised the protection fee option, it would destroy the deal's economics. The merger agreement didn't account for this cost because Bradley's team had never identified the clause during due diligence. TechCore's financing was structured to pay $76 million in cash to Dataflow shareholders, but they hadn't reserved $42 million for a vendor protection fee that would become due upon closing. The midnight closing was scheduled for October 27 at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time. Legal teams would execute documents, banks would initiate wire transfers, and by 12:01 a.m. on October 28, the merger would be legally closed. Once closed, Section 12.4 (c) of the Cloud Tech contract would be automatically triggered, and Cloud Tech would have immediate legal right to demand $42 million from the combined company or terminate the infrastructure services that Dataflow's operations depended on. At 4:47 p.m. on October 27, approximately 7 hours before midnight closing, I received an automated notification from Cloud Tech's contract management system. This was a standard notification that Cloud Tech sent to all customers whenever their contract management database detected public filings or news articles mentioning the customer in the context of M&A activity. The notification contained a simple message: Cloud Tech has detected potential change of control activity related to your account. Please review Section 12 of your service agreement regarding change of control provisions and contact your account manager if you have questions about how these provisions may apply to your situation. This was Cloud Tech's automated system doing exactly what it was designed to do, monitoring for M&A activity that might trigger contract provisions. Cloud Tech's legal team would undoubtedly be reviewing the Dataflow TechCore merger to understand the implications for their contract. It was only a matter of time before they identified Section 12.4 (c) and realized they had leverage to either extract significant payments or terminate a relationship that TechCore was planning to eliminate anyway. I forwarded the Cloud Tech notification to Marcus and Bradley at 4:52 p.m. with a note: Cloud Tech has detected the merger and is reviewing change of control provisions. Recommend we discuss Section 12.4(c) implications before tonight's closing. Marcus responded at 5:14 p.m. Harper, we've been over this. Cloud Tech has standard change of control provisions that give them renegotiation rights post-closing. This doesn't affect tonight's execution. We'll deal with Cloud Tech next week after the deal closes. At 6:23 p.m., I received a call from Jennifer Walsh, Cloud Tech's general counsel. Jennifer and I had worked together on the 2019 contract negotiations and had maintained a professional relationship over the years. Harper, I saw the merger announcement with TechCore. Congratulations. I'm reviewing our contract to understand change of control implications. Can you help me understand TechCore's infrastructure vendor relationships? Specifically, are they using Quantum Cloud for their infrastructure? I confirmed that yes, TechCore's platform was built on Quantum infrastructure and that post-merger integration plans included migrating data flow from Cloud Tech to Quantum to achieve standardization. Jennifer was quiet for a moment. Harper, that migration scenario triggers Section 12.4(c) of our agreement. You negotiated that clause in 2019 specifically to protect against this kind of situation. The contract value protection fee would be $42 million, payable upon closing of the merger. Are you aware of this? I explained that I'd been trying to raise this issue with merger leadership for weeks, but that my concerns had been characterized as technical objections that shouldn't delay the deal. Jennifer asked when the merger was scheduled to close. I told her at midnight tonight. Jennifer's tone shifted to surprise. They're closing tonight? Harper, this is a $42 million contract provision that becomes immediately enforceable upon closing. Cloud Tech's board will need to decide how to exercise our rights under 12.4(c), whether to demand the protection fee, require renegotiation, or terminate the contract. That's not a decision we can make in 5 hours. We need time to analyze this properly. I suggested Jennifer contact Marcus and Bradley directly to discuss the situation. Jennifer said she would escalate immediately to Cloud Tech's CEO and would reach out to Dataflow's leadership within the hour. She thanked me for confirming the details and ended the call. I sent Marcus and Bradley another email at 6:31 p.m. Cloud Tech's general counsel is reviewing Section 12.4(c) and has identified the $42 million protection fee provision that triggers upon closing. She will be contacting you shortly. This is material to deal with structure and timing. At 7:02 p.m., Marcus called me. His tone was sharp. Harper, I just got off the phone with Cloud Tech's CEO. He's threatening to block tonight's closing unless we address some contract provision about a protection fee. What the hell is he talking about, and why are we finding out about this 7 hours before we're supposed to close this deal? I explained Section 12.4(c) calmly and methodically. I explained that I negotiated the provision in 2019 to protect data flow in exactly this scenario, a merger with an acquirer who planned to terminate our Cloud Tech relationship in favor of a competitor vendor. I explained that the clause gave Cloud Tech the right to demand $42 million upon closing or terminating our infrastructure services, and that this right was triggered automatically when the merger closed with TechCore because TechCore used Quantum infrastructure. I explained that I'd raised this issue multiple times over the past 6 weeks and had been told not to create obstacles that delayed the deal. Marcus was silent for a long moment. You're telling me there's a $42 million penalty clause in a vendor contract that gets triggered by tonight's closing, and you've known about this for weeks? I corrected him. I've known about this clause since I negotiated it 4 years ago. I've been trying to raise it as a material consideration in merger planning since August. Bradley's team dismissed it as a standard boilerplate that could be handled post-closing. Cloud Tech is now exercising their contractual rights, which they're legally entitled to do. Marcus hung up. At 7:18 p.m., Bradley called me. His confident consultant tone was gone, replaced by barely controlled panic. Harper, Marcus just briefed me on this Cloud Tech contract situation. We need to understand exactly what this clause says and what our options are. Can you send me the contract immediately? I sent Bradley the 63-page Cloud Tech agreement with Section 12.4c highlighted. At 7:45 p.m., Bradley called back. This clause is insane. $42 million for a change of control scenario? How did this get into the contract? Why wasn't this flagged during due diligence? I explained patiently that I'd negotiated the clause to protect data flow, that I'd raised it multiple times during merger planning, and that his due diligence team had dismissed my concerns as technical details that didn't present material deal risks. Bradley asked what our options were. I outlined them. Option 1, pay Cloud Tech $42 million upon closing, which would require TechCore to provide additional cash that wasn't contemplated in the merger financing. Option 2, commit to maintaining the Cloud Tech relationship instead of migrating to Quantum, which would eliminate the cost synergies that Bradley had projected as part of merger justification. Option 3, renegotiate with Cloud Tech to reduce the protection fee or find an alternative solution, which would require time that we didn't have before midnight closing. Option 4, delay the closing until this issue was resolved, which would require notifying the board and potentially renegotiating deal terms. At 8:23 p.m., Marcus sent an email to the full board with the subject line, "Critical vendor issue requires emergency board discussion." The email explained that Cloud Tech had identified a contract provision that would require $42 million in additional payments upon closing or would require maintaining vendor relationships that would eliminate projected cost synergies. The email requested an emergency board call at 9 p.m. to discuss how to proceed. The emergency board call started at 9:07 p.m. with all 7 directors, Marcus, Bradley, myself, and both companies' legal counsel. Marcus explained the situation. A vendor contract clause that had been missed during due diligence would trigger a $42 million payment obligation upon tonight's closing. Bradley tried to frame this as an unforeseen technical issue that emerged at the last minute. Patricia and Gwynn immediately cut through that framing. Marcus, Harper raised concerns about vendor contracts during the board meeting last week. You dismissed those concerns as already reviewed and not material to the deal. Was Harper specifically trying to warn us about this Cloud Tech provision? Marcus hesitated. Harper mentioned vendor change of control clauses in general terms. She didn't specifically quantify this $42 million exposure. I spoke up from my phone line. I attempted to raise the Cloud Tech contract provision specifically in meetings with Marcus and Bradley on September 8, October 12, and in multiple emails over the past 6 weeks. Each time I was told that Bradley's M&A team had reviewed vendor contracts and that change of control provisions were standard boilerplate that didn't present material deal risks. I was explicitly instructed not to create technical objections that would delay the closing timeline. The board was silent for a moment. Another director, Robert Chen, asked Bradley directly, "Did your due diligence team review the Cloud Tech contract section 12.4c that Harper is referencing?" Bradley responded carefully, "Our team reviewed vendor contracts for standard change of control provisions. This particular clause has unusual language about competitor relationships and protection fees. That goes beyond typical provisions. In retrospect, it should have been flagged for detailed analysis." Patricia jumped in. "So to be clear, Harper tried to raise this issue multiple times. Your team told her it wasn't material, and now 7 hours before closing we're discovering a $42 million obligation that destroys the deal economics?" Bradley started to respond, but Patricia kept going. "The merger agreement contemplates $76 million in cash consideration to shareholders. If we need to pay Cloud Tech $42 million, that's more than half the cash value being wiped out by a vendor fee. This isn't a technical detail. This is a fundamental flaw in deal structure that should have been identified months ago." Marcus tried to salvage the situation. "We have several options. We can negotiate with Cloud Tech to reduce the protection fee. We can commit to maintaining their infrastructure relationship. We can ask TechCore to provide additional cash to cover the Cloud Tech payment. The point is, we can solve this if we work through it systematically." Robert asked the critical question, "Can we solve it in the next 2 hours before midnight closing? Or do we need to delay closing until we've properly evaluated our options?" The board discussed it for another 40 minutes. The conclusion was inevitable. closing at midnight without resolving the cloud tech issue would create immediate liability of $42 million that wasn't contemplated in merger financing and would likely trigger breach of warranty claims from TechCore about undisclosed material liabilities. The board voted to delay closing pending resolution of the cloud tech contract issue. Marcus was instructed to contact TechCore immediately to explain the situation and negotiate an approach to resolve the vendor contract problem. At 10:34 p.m., less than 90 minutes before the scheduled midnight closing, Marcus called TechCore's CEO to inform him that Dataflow was invoking their right to delay closing due to a material vendor contract issue that required resolution. TechCore's CEO was furious. They'd prepared their integration team, planned their Monday announcement, and now were being told the deal was delayed indefinitely. TechCore's legal team immediately began reviewing the merger agreement to understand their options. Could they walk away from the deal? Could they claim Dataflow had breached representations about undisclosed material liabilities? Could they demand price reductions to account for the cloud tech exposure? Over the next 2 weeks, negotiations collapsed into exactly the mess that Patricia and Gwynn had predicted. TechCore demanded a $42 million purchase price reduction to account for the cloud tech protection fee. Dataflow's board refused, arguing that TechCore had conducted due diligence and accepted the deal terms based on thorough review. TechCore's lawyers claimed Dataflow had failed to adequately disclose material vendor contract provisions. Dataflow's lawyers produced documentation showing Harper had attempted to raise the issue multiple times and had been dismissed by Bradley's due diligence team. On November 10, TechCore formally withdrew from the merger agreement, citing undisclosed material liabilities and failure to satisfy closing conditions. The deal was dead. Marcus's reputation as a visionary CEO was destroyed. He'd brought a merger to the brink of closing only to have it collapse due to a vendor contract that his own director of strategic partnerships had been trying to warn him about for months. The board lost confidence in Marcus's judgment and began discussing leadership changes. On November 17, Marcus announced his resignation as CEO, effective immediately. The board appointed Patricia and Gwynn as interim CEO while they conducted a search for permanent leadership. On November 20, Bradley Chen's M&A advisory firm was terminated, and Dataflow filed a malpractice claim against Bradley's firm alleging negligent due diligence that failed to identify material vendor contract provisions despite multiple warnings from Dataflow's own staff. On November 28, Patricia called me into her office. "Harper, I've been reviewing what happened with the TechCore merger. You tried to warn us about the cloud tech contract multiple times. Marcus and Bradley shut you down because they didn't want contract details interfering with their closing timeline. If we'd listened to you in September, we could have structured the deal properly or negotiated with cloud tech before we were facing a midnight deadline. Instead, we lost a deal that would have delivered significant value to shareholders, and we lost a CEO who demonstrated poor judgment by ignoring critical input from his own strategic partnerships director." Patricia offered me a new role, Senior Vice President of Strategic Operations, reporting directly to her, with expanded authority over not just vendor relationships but also M&A due diligence and contract oversight for any future transactions. My salary increased from $112,000 to $175,000, a 56% increase. I was given explicit authority to veto any transaction or agreement that created unacceptable contract risk, and I was added to the board as a non-voting observer to ensure operational perspective was included in strategic decisions. 6 months later, in May 2024, I ran into Bradley Chen at a business conference in Charlotte. He was working as an independent M&A consultant after his advisory firm had settled Dataflow's malpractice claim and asked him to leave the partnership. He saw me and approached with forced friendliness. "Harper, good to see you. I heard you got promoted after that whole TechCore situation." "Senior VP, that's impressive." I looked at him. The role reflects what happens when boards realize that contract details matter and that ignoring warnings from people who actually understand strategic agreements destroys deal value. Bradley shifted uncomfortably. That cloud tech contract clause was really unusual. Nobody could have predicted it would become such a major issue. I responded calmly, "I predicted it. That's why I negotiated that clause in 2019, to protect Dataflow in exactly the scenario that happened. That's why I raised it with you in September, October, and multiple times in between." You dismissed my concerns as technical details that didn't present material risks. Then when Cloud Tech exercised their contractual rights 7 hours before closing, you discovered that the technical details you'd ignored just destroyed a $218 million deal. Bradley didn't have a good response. He made an excuse about needing to attend a session and walked away. Thanks for staying through this entire story. Everyone who's ever had expertise dismissed as technical details by executives who didn't understand that the details are where deals succeed or fail. If this resonated with you, if you've ever tried to warn decision makers about contract provisions or operational realities only to be told not to create obstacles, subscribe and share your story. These workplace tales remind us that technical expertise has strategic value, that contract clauses exist for good reasons, and that executives who dismiss warnings from people who actually understand the details learn expensive lessons when those details destroy their plans at midnight closings.